Hi, I'm Femi OK. Today on the stream, we are going to be joined by the award-winning Jamaican writer Marlon James. You can be part of our conversation as well via YouTube. We're going to be talking about the Dark Star Trilogy, his work, and writing fantasy literature with Africans in it. Marlon James, welcome back to the stream. It's been a little while, so good to see you. Welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's great to be back.
I can see a couple of your books in the background. You're so successful now. I am shocked, Marlon, that still publishers will see your work and say, no, it's not for me. Do they not get you by now?
I don't know if it's a situation where they don't get themselves. I think, I was looking at funny enough, some of the mixed reviews that came out last week in the UK. And one thing that's really interesting is there's still a resistance to non-white writing that doesn't write to the white gaze. Yeah. I'm writing in English, but I'm not playing by the Queen's rules. Yeah. We're doing what we do. I mean, it's bad enough that we're using this language, but we're subverting it. We're playing by our rules. We're doing things that we're not supposed to do. We do things like not distinguishing between a past tense and present tense of the verb. Wolof speakers do it, Jamaican Patois speakers do it, Nigerian Pidgin speakers do it. Who doesn't do it are stodgy British lit establishment. So there is still a kind of a resistance for literature that doesn't go out of its way to meet a certain kind of reader on their terms.
Marlon, I'm going to take us back and our audience back to August of 2015, and that was when you were longlisted for the Man Booker Prize, and somehow, miraculously, you agreed to physically come into our studio in Washington, D.C. Very end of that show, this is what I asked you. You're writing what right now?
I am writing, what am I doing? I'm trying to write a novel that plays on African myths and mythologies and legends. So I'm actually going, speaking of comics, I'm going total geek. Okay, so I'm writing a fantasy novel.
Is a chart required? Have you got Post-its and stuff going on?
I have a whole room full of Post-its, pictures, film, video. Oh my goodness. Because I did it, I mean, usually I do it to an extent with each novel where I kind of create a space that's in the feel of it.
Does this mythological story have a title yet?
No, it does not.
Oh, okay.
But
all right.
I'm working on it.
Look at us, Marlon.
I had so much, I had so much here.
And we were so young and fresh and firm back then. 7 years later, though, Marlon, 7 years later. Look, results. Not one book, two books. So this geeking out that you did has borne fruit. Let's talk about how you go about creating this different kind of African world that is fantasy, full of black people. Go ahead.
Well, the first thing, it's very easy to simply just grab facts. That's not hard. It used to be harder because most of a lot of the history and so on that was written about the continent was written by Europeans, and right now those really only serve, the only purpose that serve really is comic relief, because those books are so ridiculous. But there's a lot of work, present day and contemporary history and anthropological work and, gathering of records and gathering of the words, songs and words of the griots, all of that. The information is there. That's not enough. I had to change how I read it. So I had to change how I came across that information. I had to change my idea that history told by a griot is of a lower standard than a history told by a historian. They're both historians. So it wasn't just delving into tons of research, and I did, as that video shows, but it was also changing how I read that research, changing how I looked at all of that, changing how I perceive information and so on. And so that also was a major part of the research process, learning how to read differently.
One of the ways that you ground yourself in the world you create is by using maps, drawing maps. So you started to draw maps. I don't know if the maps in the book is actually your design work or whether then you then send it off to a designer. But I want to show a couple of these maps and help us understand how they then ground the world that you're writing about. Here's some maps.
Yeah. Well, actually, they are my design and illustrating work. You know, back in another life, I was a designer and an illustrator. I used to do graphic design. I used to even work on Sean Paul's album covers. That was a lifetime ago.
Excuse me, humble brag alert, humble brag alert.
So you know, so the problem, of course, is I'm then that guy in the publishing house. Back when I was a designer, I didn't. So I'm that nightmare.
Yeah.
But you know, the thing about fantasy is that it's very easy when you're writing an imagined world to feel like a tourist in your own book. And the way to get around that is to create a world that you're already living in. And the great thing about maps is that maps do this interesting thing. They define you and then they confine you. And the confine is actually good because you feel as if you're bouncing against a real world. I can't just have a character go from north to south in a week anymore because the map says it takes 4 months. So I have to lengthen the story. And you know, it gives me the sense that I'm writing about an actual place. So I drew some maps, then I started writing, and the maps inspired the writing, but then a little after that, the writing starts to inspire the maps. And there's this ongoing thing going, you know, that continues. But yeah, it was a lot of fun. Talk about geeking out. That was a lot of fun to do, although I had to reteach myself Photoshop and all these things, which I haven't had to do in years.
You did a good job. Congratulations. You wrote the book and designed the maps. All right. So I want you to meet Professor Juan J. Morales. He has a question for you, Marlon. Here it is.
Ooh.
What strikes me most about Marlon James's work is how every chapter surprises us and it delivers these unexpected situations. It gives voice to overlooked people. The characters are beautiful, they're tragic, and the monsters are just super scary nightmare fodder. And the settings are powerfully built with all that brick-faced storytelling. And it gives countless writers and readers all these new doors to open that remind us that genre writing is literary. There's a larger cultural experience to be offered by fantasy, sci-fi, and horror. I'm wondering, can you tell us more about your process using African languages in the Dark Star Trilogy while inviting a Western audience to read and experience these languages so naturally?
Oh, that's a great question. I wanted to almost add to it what he was saying about genre. That you know, genre division serves nobody, and the problem with genre can define a work, but it can also have people start ranking forms of literature, which goes against everything. It goes against human nature. Fantasy ultimately is myth making, and our myths are important. And we can talk about this later about how this came about because I felt I was missing my mythological history, but now I'm completely not answering the question, so I'm going to answer the question.
Yes, teacher, please answer the question.
Yeah, yes, it's. So I want to study, and I mean, I don't want to claim that I know Wolof because I'm just starting, but the cool thing about learning a language is you learn the rules first.
Yeah.
And following the rule, when I started to learn the rules of languages, which I wasn't going to quote in depth in the book, but I know I wanted to use as a base in which to then do English, I learned things like where to place a verb, if we want to get that technical. You know, when I growing up in Jamaica, there are a lot of aspects of Jamaican patois that we're taught is simply inferior English. I always thought the fact that I don't say went. Nobody wents in Jamaican English. Him did go, or he soon go, or he can go, or he won't go. Hell, we even say he going go. And I've always thought of that as what I was told. It's broken English. It's, you know, except it's not that at all. It's one of it's another fantastic example of something that even the slave trade couldn't kill. The way in which we come to the middle and end of a sentence, the way that for us, action is always active. when I talk about slavery and I talk about atrocities done to us, I frequently, and I'm not the only one, we frequently speak in the present tense. And it doesn't necessarily mean we're living in trauma so much as temporality is a different thing for us.
Yeah, yeah.
Past, present, and future is a different. It is actually different. And it's when I come across a lot of criticism, it's always that they didn't find a way to get into that. And I was like, well, I'm writing blackly. What can I tell you?
Well,
it's it's a different way, and I think that's what I drew from.
Marlon, do you know, you just brought up a memory of me spending my entire childhood telling my dad, you have to say, turn off the light, Dad, not off the light. And he's like, sure, off the light. My entire life, it was always off the light. And now I like, at this conversation, it's helping me really appreciate the richness of language. It doesn't have to be that rigid. Talking about,
but it also turns off into a verb. Like in Jamaica, we turn done into a verb. You know, done no.
Yeah. All right, so the latest installment of the Dark Star Trilogy is Moon Witch, Spider King. In a sentence, tell us what it's about, and then read us a paragraph, because a great Jamaican writer once said, the best literature can be read aloud.
I wonder who that was.
I wonder. All right. Moon Witch, Spider King. Go ahead.
Moon Witch, Spider King. What can I say? One of the villains of the first book gets to tell her story, and man, is it different. You know, if you've read Black Leopard, Red Wolf, you may have had some attachment to some of the characters. You probably are going to regret that. So I'm going to read a very, very quick section about, in this section, Sogolon becomes aware of her impact in the world. Which, if you're a fan of, you've read Black Leopard, Red Wolf, you probably didn't even know she did this. She didn't know either until she was told. So this is her. More women come into the room as it get lighter, and still more women. Or perhaps I was seeing them all for the first time. You don't remember me, one of them say. She wear a band around the eyes that her husband take away from her. After you right the wrong done to me, the woman teach me how to see. With my fingers, my ears, and my nose, she say, as she paint clay on my skin with grace. You don't know me, for then I was no woman, say yet another. I call each of those women my sisters since then. You remember us? The girls kidnapped in that caravan headed to Marabanga. They was taking us out to sea to sell us off as wife and concubines. We was 7 and 8. That night you swooped down on the roof was the night I know the gods didn't forget us. Every woman in the room touched by the moon witch stepped forward, the woman say. And every woman in the room look at me and approach the bed and surround it. They packed the room right up to the doorway, and still more was outside, waiting to squeeze themselves in. A girl wormed through them to touch me and say, they couldn't move my mother, so they sent me. Moon witch still flying through the trees, say another. Now plenty women out there righting wrongs. Plenty in north and south saying, Moon witch, she is me.
Thank you, Marlon. That's beautiful. The worlds that you create, the narratives that you create, the characters are sexy. They are sensual, sexy beings. And something really jumped out at me is that they are, I don't even want to say queer characters, they are gender fluid. And there is a whole backstory about why and how and humor around that. And it's just a very natural evolution. Now, if people only know Africa from 2022, then they are going to think that then you are subverting what many African countries now feel about gender fluidity.
Right.
But what you're doing is reclaiming an Africa from before colonial times. Tell us more.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I didn't set out, certainly not with Black Leopard, to write anything queer. I didn't think I was trying to write something queer positive. I was just following the research. And it was the research that led to all of that. You know, I remember on Facebook, the novelist Lola, somebody asked the novelist Lola Shunyan, and I'm pronouncing her name wrong. I'm pretty sure I am. You know, if Nigeria if Africa would ever be ready for queerness and queer rights and so on. And she said Africa was born ready until a bunch of TV preachers told them that they weren't. And that's what I've come to realize, from what I've heard from my friends who are writers, everybody knew the two aunts down the end of the street. And everybody knew that they weren't aunts and they weren't sisters.
Yeah.
Everybody knew. And one of the great things that we've absorbed, another thing that survived colonialism, that survived slavery, is the ability for Black communities to absorb the other. So, he's the town queer, but he our queer. He's kind of messed up in the head, but he's our messed up in the head. We've always done that. It's one of the very unique aspects about Africanness and Blackness and where we come from is our ability to widen community. And I didn't realize that until, I did the research, that they've always made space. There are bands of soldiers and warriors in a lot of these ancient African societies who everybody knew they were gay. Because that's how you gain a reputation that your virgin bride will be protected traveling with us, because who's going to try anything? We don't go for that. It's been there. Everybody knew. We're protecting virgin cargo. You call those guys. And there's always been, and you read, and the more stuff I've read is the more I found it. I honestly didn't go to the research looking for validation. I certainly didn't think I was going to find it in the past. And that's where I found it.
I have some questions for you from our audience who are watching right now. Let me start with Wavy Tay. I hope you get a movie or show deal. I would love to see his books come to life. Tell us about movies, tell us about show deals. What's going on?
Send a tweet to Michael B. Jordan. Actually, they're working. So Michael's company bought the rights a few years ago. Of course, everything COVID added 2 years to, including this.
Yeah.
So we're moving. We're trying to move full speed ahead. We're trying to regain our momentum. But we're already working on a script. We have some very talented people already attached to developing the first of the three. But yeah, it's still in production. It's still full speed ahead. I don't have timelines or deadlines yet, but we're getting there.
All right, this other question from YouTube. We've got lots, but I'm going to share this one because this is from Louis C. Rincon Alba. I am teaching a brief history of 7 killings at NYU, one of Marlon's previous books, for a Caribbean music class. And I was wondering if Marlon has any tips on how to engage novels in a classroom setting.
Oof. How to engage? Are you asking me for lit teacher tips?
Yes, and you are a creative writer teacher, so what do you do?
I think one of the things I do with novels sometimes is I try to also link them with source material. That if we're going to talk about Bob Marley, then maybe we should listen to some Bob Marley, or maybe we should also spend some time and talking about lyrics or the poetics of reggae music, and also I love using film when I'm teaching literature. That everybody should watch Rockers. Harder They Come, yes, and Rockers and so on. That what you want to do is I said is you don't just want to read a book, you want to smell it. You want to taste it. You want the sun to burn down on your back.
Nice. Lewis, is going to be...
you want...
Yeah.
Yeah, you just want all that sensory detail. And the more sensory detail you can bring into that classroom, I think the better.
That's going to be a great class. Thank you, Marlon, for sharing that.
That is not an endorsement of bringing weed to class. I just want to say that.
You say it like you may have done it.
I would have been fired, I think.
Marshelle Farrell is a medical psychotherapist and a writer, and she has a question for you, Marlon. Here she is.
As a fellow child of the 80s from the Caribbean diaspora, I find the work that you're doing with revisiting and remembering our mythologies and the history before this ground zero of slavery so powerful and important. mostly because as a therapist, I know that when we cannot remember who we really are and what really lies behind the things that we do, we end up compelled to repeat them. And so my question for you is, do you have a hope? What hope do you have for a wider impact of your book? Beyond, of course, as many people as possible buying copies and reading them. You know, what impact do you hope that your writing might have?
I think I have two answers to that. One is I hope it encourages more people to write books like these. Toni Morrison says she wrote, the books she wanted to read, and I think one reason why it took me this long to write these books is because I never thought that these books could have been possible, even if I were to write them. And that's one thing. I do hope that more and more writers recognize that the mythologies that's lurking right behind them are rich for their own literature. In terms of readers, I hope that the mediums that we have that we can empower us, whether it's even Twitter or social media or so on, that we use more. Because one thing I've realized, and you're going to realize it if you're writing a Caribbean novel, an African novel, a Native American novel that primarily speaks in a voice that is in your head, is that the audience, you'll find an audience has always been there and waiting and ready to hear you. That doesn't mean necessarily the establishment is. It doesn't mean necessarily the publishing industry understands you or so on. So being in touch with those readers, yes, do that Reddit AMA and all of that becomes really, really important, because when I come across readers, they feel such a sense of familiarity with the work. They see such a sense of connection that sometimes surprise me, because sometimes I go through all these sort of gatekeepers or so on to get to them, and it makes me think sometimes that maybe I'm not writing the right things or so on. And I can imagine that there are young writers out there who really do wonder if anybody wants to hear their voice. And the answer is yes, they do.
I watched a lecture that you did a few years ago, and it was a Tolkien lecture. So it's a very prestigious lecture to do. You talk about fantasy literature, you talk about your work and lots of other fantasy literature at the time. There was a moment that just cracked me up, because I have this sort of dual heritage where I studied English literature, but I'm African. So I have this like, how do I get my African canon and understand English literature at the same time? It's a mishmash. And you mentioned The Hobbit. I'm just going to show you the picture here. And I feel like what we know currently as fantasy, fiction, and literature triggered you into writing the Dark Star Trilogy, because there is not a single black, brown person of color on that poster. So now, when your books are made into movies, young people, wherever they are around the world, they're going to have a very different vision of fantasy worlds.
Yeah, because I think there is still this idea that fantasy is ultimately a medieval historical novel with Merlin in it, or with witches and goblins and dragons. A mythological history, and I love Merlin as much as anybody else. I am here for King Arthur. I'm here for the Green Knight, and I love my dragons and goblins and my Grimm's fairy tales. That's all well and good. There's something to be said, though, for constantly reading literature where nobody like you is in it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
And it creates a sort of disembodied relationship to work that
Marlon
I don't
James.
think a white person.
I'm going to leave it there. Right, let me show everybody. On my laptop. Moon Witch, Spider King by Marlon James, currently available. You've heard the writer. You hear where he's coming from. The book is available right now. Thank you to your YouTubers. You said to Marlon, we are so inspired. That makes the two of us. See you next time. Thanks, Marlon.